Hey everyone, go ahead and dim the lights, find your favorite blanket, and maybe pour yourself something warm. Tonight, we're heading out to the middle of nowhere, and I mean the real middle of nowhere. We're going to the Sakha Republic in Siberia. It's a place where the air doesn't just bite, it tries to delete you from existence. It's minus 71 degrees Celsius. Your eyelashes are currently tiny icicles, and somehow, life still finds a way to be incredibly weird. Tonight, we're talking about an 80-year-old woman, a very desperate mother bear, and the kind of hospitality you can only find at the edge of the world. Let's just drift into the snow and see what happens. Now, you have to understand the Siberian wilderness. It's beautiful, sure, if you like infinite white and the constant threat of hypothermia. People who live here aren't like the rest of us. They don't complain when the Wi-Fi is slow. They're too busy making sure their breath doesn't freeze into a solid brick. Enter our protagonist, Maria. She's 80. She's seen everything. She's lived through regimes, famines, and winters that would make a polar bear consider a timeshare in Florida. Maria lives in a small wooden cabin that looks like it's being slowly swallowed by the earth. It's cozy, though. It smells like pine needles and old tea. And one night, when the wind was howling like a choir of banshees, there was a knock at the door. Now, normally, at minus 71 degrees, you don't expect visitors. You certainly don't expect a visitor who weighs 600 pounds and has paws the size of dinner plates. Because why wouldn't a brown bear show up? Of course you would. Maria opens the door, probably expecting a neighbor who ran out of sugar, and instead she's staring at a mother bear. But this wasn't a National Geographic predatory moment. This was a "I've had a really long day and my kid is sick" moment. The bear wasn't growling. She was just standing there, holding a cub that looked a little worse for wear. Because apparently, in Siberia, when the local vet is 300 miles away, you go to the lady who makes the best broth in the district. It's an ironic contrast, really. You have this apex predator, a creature capable of ending a human life with a casual swipe, standing on a porch like a shy teenager asking for directions. Maria, being a grandmother of the highest order, didn't scream, she didn't grab a rifle. She probably just sighed, looked at the bear and thought, well, I suppose the tea is still hot. The bear nudged the cub forward. The little guy was shivering, which is saying something when you literally evolved to live in a freezer. He had that "I ate something I shouldn't have" look, or perhaps he was just struggling with the sheer absurdity of being a bear in a place where the air is liquid nitrogen adjacent. Maria stepped back, and the bear, as if she'd read the room and realized she wasn't invited for tea but her son was, just waited. It was a silent agreement, a sort of interspecies pact made over the shared understanding that minus 71 degrees is simply too cold for anyone to be a jerk.
So there Maria is, standing in her doorway with the heat of her wood stove escaping into the Siberian night, looking at a bear cub that's basically a shivering carpet remnant. And the mother bear is just lingering. She's not trying to come in. Even a bear knows that 80-year-old Siberian grandmothers have very strict rules about muddy paws on the rug, but she's definitely not leaving. She's just parked herself on the porch like a very large, very furry gargoyle. Maria looks at the cub. The cub looks at Maria. It's that classic "I'm miserable and it's your problem now" look that toddlers and small animals have perfected over millennia. Maria sighs because of course she's going to help. When you've survived 80 years of permafrost, a sick bear is just a Tuesday. She reaches down and scoops up the cub. Now keep in mind, a bear cub isn't exactly a kitten. It's dense. It's essentially a muscle-bound potato covered in coarse wool. She carries him over to a pile of old blankets near the stove. The mother bear watches through the open door, her breath huffing out in great white clouds that instantly crystallize and fall to the floor like diamond dust. It's all very cinematic if you ignore the smell of wet fur and the fact that there's a literal predator supervising the medical procedure. Maria's medical kit is exactly what you'd expect: a jar of honey that's probably older than the cub, some dried herbs that smell like a forest fire, and a bowl of warm goat's milk. Because why not? If it works for a grumpy husband, it'll work for a carnivore. As she starts tending to the cub, we have to appreciate the irony of the situation. Here is a woman whose ancestors probably spent centuries hunting these creatures for survival, and now she's basically running a boutique urgent care center for them. The cub, sensing that he's hit the jackpot in terms of indoor heating, stops shivering and starts making that weird, low humming sound bears make when they're not trying to eat you. It's a rhythmic, sleepy sound, sort of like a fuzzy chainsaw running on a low battery. Outside, the mother bear settles down. She's leaning against the doorframe because even in the middle of a Siberian winter, she's decided that this specific porch is the safest place on the planet. And honestly, she's right. Nobody is messing with a house guarded by an 80-year-old woman and a 600-pound bodyguard. The night stretches on. The wind is still doing its best to knock the cabin over, but inside, it's just the crackle of the fire and the slow, heavy breathing of two bears and one very tired woman. Maria sits in her rocking chair, knitting, because what else are you going to do while babysitting a bear? And occasionally glancing at the door. Every time she looks, there are the mother bear's eyes reflecting the firelight. No aggression, just a very tired mom waiting for her kid to feel better so they can go back to doing bear things. It's the kind of peace that only exists when the world outside is trying to kill everything. You just hunker down, share your honey, and wait for the sun, which, let's be honest, won't be showing up for another 3 months anyway.
The recovery and the long, cold goodbye. So, we're back in the cabin. The fire is doing that low, rhythmic pop and crackle thing that makes you want to close your eyes and forget that gravity exists. Maria is still there, clicking her knitting needles together, which is probably the only sound for about 200 miles in any direction. On the floor, the cub is finally asleep. He's not just sleeping, he's passed out in that way only something that has spent its entire life fighting for survival can do when it finally feels a bit of central heating. He looks less like a fierce forest predator and more like a burnt loaf of sourdough bread that someone left on a pile of wool. Outside, the mother bear is still a permanent fixture on the porch. She's essentially become part of the architecture at this point. If Maria wanted to leave, she'd have to climb over a literal wall of fur and muscle. But Maria isn't going anywhere, because, again, it's minus 71 degrees Celsius. If you step outside for more than 3 minutes without a plan, you basically become a permanent ice sculpture. So the three of them are locked in this strange cross-species slumber party. Maria looks down at the cub and notices his breathing is leveled out. Earlier, he'd been wheezing, a sort of pathetic, high-pitched rattle that probably broke the mother bear's heart, or whatever version of a heart a Siberian brown bear has. Now, it's a deep, resonant thrum. Maria decides it's time for the secret weapon. She reaches for a jar on the shelf labeled in faded Cyrillic. It's some sort of fermented berry concoction that's probably 40% sugar and 60% sheer willpower. She dabs a bit on the cub's nose. He twitches. His little pink tongue licks it off, and his eyes flutter open. He looks at Maria with this expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. He's probably thinking, why am I in a box? Why is it warm? And why does this old lady smell like lavender and goat's milk? But he doesn't bite. He just rolls onto his back, exposing a round, fuzzy belly. It's a bold move for a wild animal, but when you've been served premium honeyberries in a heated cabin, you tend to lower your guard. Maria gives his belly a quick, unceremonial pat. "You're fine," she mutters in a voice that sounds like dry leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "Now stop being a drama queen and get ready to go back to the icebox." Of course, the icebox is currently screaming. The wind has picked up, hitting the side of the cabin with the force of a freight train. The mother bear outside shifts her weight, and the whole porch groans. It's a heavy, tired sound. It's the sound of the world being too big and too cold. Maria looks at the door and thinks about the irony of it all. Humans spend so much time building walls to keep nature out, but sometimes nature just knocks and asks for a blanket. As the hours tick by, and in Siberia, hours feel like weeks, the cub starts to regain his strength. He begins to explore the cabin. This is the part where most people would panic.
A bear cub, even a sick one, is basically a wrecking ball with claws. He investigates a stack of firewood. He sniffs a heavy iron pot. He considers chewing on the leg of a hand-carved chair, but decides against it after Maria gives him the look. You know the look. It's the one grandmothers have used for centuries to stop wars and prevent sticky fingers on the good furniture. It works on bears, too. The mother bear sticks her head through the door again. She doesn't come in, she's too big, and she seems to respect the threshold. She just lets out a low, vibrating huff. It's not a growl, it's a, "Hey kid, the sun is technically up, even though we can't see it through the blizzard. Time to go." The cub looks at the warm stove. Then he looks at the dark, freezing doorway. He's clearly weighing his options. On one hand, infinite warmth and honey. On the other hand, a lifetime of eating frozen fish and sleeping in a hole in the ground. Because nature is cruel, he chooses the hole. He stands up on all fours, gives himself a massive shake, sending bits of Maria's blanket everywhere, and trots toward the door. Maria watches him go. She doesn't try to pet him goodbye. She doesn't take a selfie. She just stands there with her hands on her hips, looking like a very tired warden releasing a prisoner. The cub reaches the porch and is immediately greeted by his mother. She licks his head with a tongue that's probably the size of a washcloth, checking him over with a frantic maternal energy that's honestly a bit relatable. Then the mother bear does something weird. She stops. She looks past the cub, straight at Maria. For a second, the snarky commentary fades. It's just two mothers, well, one human, one bear, staring at each other in the middle of a frozen wasteland. There's a nod, or maybe the bear was just adjusting her neck, but Maria likes to think it was a nod, a thanks for not letting my idiot son freeze to death kind of gesture. And then, just like that, they're gone. They melt into the white wall of the storm. The mother bear's massive footprints have filled in by drifting snow within seconds. Maria closes the heavy wooden door, drops the iron bolt back into place, and the cabin is silent again. She walks over to the stove, picks up the bowl of leftover goat's milk and sets it on the table. She looks at the mess of fur and honey on her floor. Typical, she whispers to the empty room, doesn't even say thank you. She sits back down in her rocking chair. The needles start clicking again. The fire is burning low, turning into a deep orange glow that feels like a hug for your brain. The storm is still there, but it feels further away now. Maria closes her eyes, drifting off to the sound of the wind, knowing that somewhere out there, in the -71-degree darkness, there's a cub with a full belly and a very relieved mother. And that's where we'll leave them, just drifting in the cold. If you're still awake, maybe it's time to pull your own blanket a little tighter. The world is a strange place, but as long as there's a bit of honey and a warm stove, things aren't so bad. Sleep well. The king who was too related to function. Hey again. If you're still with me, I hope you're feeling heavy and relaxed. Maybe your phone is face down, and you're just letting the sound of my voice pull you toward sleep. We've left the Siberian bears behind, and now we're drifting across the ocean and back through time to the 17th century Spanish court. It was a place of gold, velvet, and enough incense to choke a horse. But mostly, it was a place where people really liked to keep it in the family. Tonight, we're talking about Charles II of Spain. He's often called the Bewitched, but honestly, the genetically compromised would have been a bit more accurate. Because, you see, when your family tree is less of a tree and more of a single tangled vine that's been growing in a dark closet for 200 years, things tend to get complicated. Let's set the scene. Imagine a palace. It's quiet. The hallways are lined with dark paintings of ancestors who all have the exact same chin. This is the Habsburg jaw. It wasn't just a facial feature, it was a brand. If you had the jaw, you had the throne. But by the time Charles was born in 1661, that brand had become a bit of a burden.
Charles was the son of Philip IV and Mariana of Austria. Now, if we were looking at a normal family, Mariana would be Philip's niece, but in the Habsburg world, she was also his cousin, and basically every other branch of the family tree simultaneously. By the time Charles arrived, his inbreeding coefficient was actually higher than that of a child born to two siblings. Just let that sink in as you drift off. He was more related to himself than most people are to their own parents. When he was born, the court was, of course, overjoyed. They had an heir. But even the most optimistic courtier had to admit that baby Charles was a bit of a project. He didn't speak until he was 4. He didn't walk until he was 8. And his jaw? Well, his jaw was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth didn't actually meet. He couldn't chew his food. He just sort of inhaled it. It's a very ironic contrast, isn't it? The most powerful monarch in the world, master of the Spanish Empire, and he's being defeated by a piece of boiled chicken. The Spanish court, being the dramatic, superstitious place it was, decided that Charles wasn't the victim of a century of poor dating choices. No, they decided he was bewitched. Clearly some sorcerer had put a hex on him, because why accept the boring reality of genetics when you can blame a literal witch? So, while the empire was slowly crumbling and the French were nibbling at the borders, the Spanish court spent their time performing exorcisms on their king. They'd bring in monks, they'd chant, they'd probably throw some holy water around. Charles just sat there looking confused. He was a very gentle soul, really. He wasn't a tyrant, he wasn't cruel, he was just a man who was very, very tired of alive. He spent most of his days in the palace, surrounded by people who were terrified of him dying without an heir, because if Charles died, the whole Spanish Empire would go up for grabs. It was like a game of musical chairs, but the chairs were made of gold, and the music was a funeral dirge. Charles's first wife was Marie-Louise of Orleans. She was young, French, and understandably horrified when she arrived in Madrid. She had been used to the sparkling, lively court of Versailles. Now she was stuck in a gloomy palace with a husband who looked like a half-baked potato and spent his time playing with mechanical toys. But being a professional royal, she tried her best. She even grew fond of him in a weird, maternal way. They would sit together and eat sweets, which was about the extent of their romantic life. When Marie-Louise eventually passed away, without providing an heir, of course, the court immediately went shopping for a new queen. They found Maria Anna of Neuburg. She was intense. She was told that her only job was to get pregnant. She spent her days pressuring Charles, who was already struggling just to stand up straight. It was a miserable, slow-motion disaster. Poor Charles. His health was a constant topic of conversation. The ambassadors from other countries would write home with detailed, almost gleeful reports about his latest ailments. The king's legs are swollen today. The king has lost another tooth. The king seems to have forgotten where he is. It was the 17th century equivalent of a celebrity gossip rag, but instead of fashion choices, they were documenting the slow collapse of a human being. By the time Charles reached his 30s, he looked like a man in his 80s. He was bald, he was partially deaf, and he suffered from frequent hallucinations. He once ordered the bodies of his ancestors to be dug up so he could look at them. He even had the coffin of his first wife opened so he could see her one last time. It's dark, isn't it? But in that sleepy, monotone way, it's also just very sad. He was looking for a connection in a world where he was fundamentally alone, trapped in a body that was essentially a prison. The end finally came in 1700. Charles was 38. His last will and testament was a document that would eventually trigger the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that would burn through Europe for over a decade. But as Charles lay on his bedside, he wasn't thinking about empires or wars. He was probably just thinking about how quiet the room was. He died on November 1st. The autopsy report, which is a real document, and quite a read, was absolutely brutal. The doctors said his heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, and his head was full of water. It was as if his body had simply given up on the concept of being a body. And so the Habsburg line in Spain ended, not with a bang, but with a very long, very exhausted sigh. The empire was carved up, the French moved in, and the world moved on. But the story of Charles II remains, a cautionary tale about what happens when you prioritize purity over, well, having a functioning chin. It's a strange thing to think about as you drift off to sleep. All that power, all that gold, and it all came down to a man who just wanted to play with his toys and not be bewitched anymore. The lights are low in the palace now. The candles have burned down to nothing. The ghosts of the Habsburgs are finally quiet. And you should be too. Let your mind wander back from 1700 Spain. Leave the velvet and the incense behind. You're back in your bed. The air is the perfect temperature. Your breathing is slow and steady. The story is over, the history is settled, and there's nothing left to do but let go. Sleep now. Just drift.
The Tsar, the Mystic, and the Giant Golden Error. Welcome back. I hope you're feeling heavy-limbed and cozy. If you've survived the frozen bears of Siberia and the unfortunate jawlines of Spain, you're doing great. Tonight, we're heading to St. Petersburg. It's a city of marble palaces, freezing canals, and a royal family that was, quite frankly, out of its depth in a way that is almost impressive. We're talking about the end of the Romanov dynasty. It's a story of velvet, revolution, and a bearded man from the woods who just wouldn't go away. Imagine a room filled with Fabergé eggs. They're gold, they're covered in diamonds, and they're utterly useless. That was essentially the vibe of the Russian imperial court under Nicholas II. Nicholas was a man who loved his family, loved his garden, and loved taking long walks. Unfortunately, his day job was being the absolute autocrat of the largest country on earth. It's an ironic contrast, really. A man who wanted to be a quiet country gentleman, but was instead handed a crown that weighed more than his entire personality. Nicholas married Alexandra, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, and because this is European royalty we're talking about, Alexandra brought a little something extra in her luggage, the gene for hemophilia. This meant that their only son and heir, Alexei, had blood that wouldn't clot. In a world before modern medicine, a bruised knee wasn't just a childhood injury, it was a national crisis. Enter Grigory Rasputin. Now, picture a man who looks like he's lived in a bush for 3 years, smells like a damp cellar, and has eyes that seem to be looking at your soul and your sandwich at the same time. That's Rasputin. He was a holy man from Siberia who somehow found his way into the Winter Palace. Why? Because when Alexei was bleeding and the doctors were useless, Rasputin would sit by the boy's bed, tell some stories, and miraculously the bleeding would stop. Was it hypnosis? Was it the fact that he told the doctors to stop giving the boy aspirin, which ironically thins the blood? Or was it just weird cosmic luck? Whatever it was, the Empress Alexandra was convinced. To her, Rasputin was a saint. To the rest of Russia, he was a disaster in a tunic. The storytelling here gets a bit drowsy, because honestly, the Romanovs lived in a bubble. While the rest of the world was moving toward the 20th century, Nicholas and Alexandra were busy having tea and listening to Rasputin talk about the spirit. They were living in a slow-motion dream, while a nightmare was brewing outside their gates.
Rasputin's presence at court was a gift to every satirist and revolutionary in Russia. People whispered that he was the real power behind the throne. They whispered that he was having affairs with the Empress. They whispered that he was a German spy. Most of this was nonsense, but in history, the truth is often less important than what people believe while they're standing in a breadline in the snow. The humor here is dry because the Romanovs were so profoundly disconnected from reality. Nicholas would write in his diary about how beautiful the weather was on the same day his troops were losing a massive battle. Had tea, read a book, walked the dog, the monarchy is collapsing. Quite lovely sunset. It's that kind of energy. By 1916, the Russian nobility decided that Rasputin had to go. They didn't like his influence, and they certainly didn't like his table manners. What followed was one of the most absurd assassination attempts in history. It's been told 1,000 times, but in the spirit of a sleepy monologue, let's look at the sheer, clumsy irony of it. Prince Felix Yusupov invited Rasputin over for cakes and wine, but these weren't your standard tea cakes. They were laced with enough cyanide to kill a small village. He ate them, he drank the wine, and then he asked for more. Felix was understandably panicked. Imagine poisoning someone and having them ask for seconds. It's the ultimate awkward guest scenario. Eventually, they had to resort to more direct methods. They shot him several times, and yet, according to the legend, the man still kept trying to get up. He was like a villain in a low-budget horror movie who didn't understand that the scene was over. They eventually threw him into the icy Malaya Nevka River, and when they found him, the cause of death was officially drowning. He had survived the poison and the bullets, but even a Siberian mystic has a limit when it comes to being underwater in December. But killing Rasputin didn't save the Romanovs. If anything, it made things worse. Alexandra became even more secluded, convinced that her only protector was gone. Nicholas stayed in his bubble, convinced that the Russian people still loved him like a father. It's a tragic, ironic contrast, the unannounced emperor being completely oblivious to the fact that his children were currently building barricades. The end of the Romanovs is well documented, but let's look at the quiet details. When they were eventually arrested and sent to Siberia, back to the cold we started with, they didn't act like fallen tyrants. They acted like people on a very long, very boring vacation. They took photos, they knitted, they shoveled snow. Nicholas seemed almost relieved to not be Tsar anymore. He finally had the quiet life he wanted. It just happened to be in a house guarded by revolutionary soldiers. In the final nights in the Ipatiev house, the family stayed together, tucked away from a world that had moved on without them. The gold was gone, the pearls were sewn into their corsets, and the Fabergé eggs were being looted. All that remained was the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a family waiting for a morning that wouldn't be quite what they expected. As we think about the Romanovs, let's let the image of St. Petersburg fade. The marble palaces are cold and empty. The snow is falling over the Neva River, covering the tracks of the past. The history of empires is always just a series of people making very confident mistakes in very expensive rooms. The fire in your own room is the only one that matters now. The Romanovs are gone, the Habsburgs are a memory, and even the Siberian bears have found a place to sleep. The world is large, old, and very tired, and so are you. Your thoughts are like the snow in St. Petersburg, soft, silent, and drifting slowly to the ground. There are no more kings to worry about, no more mystics at the door, just the quiet, steady pull of sleep. Close your eyes. Let the centuries wash over you.
The long monologue of history is finally reaching its quietest chapter. Sleep well. Just drift.